hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and this week we're continuing our little historic tour of Queensland. Last week we talked about Ipswich Mental Hospital, known as Sandy Gallup, which obviously is now my favorite hospital name. But today we're going to talk about the very first asylum in Queensland. Trigger warnings for this episode include the use of outdated, ableist, and racist language. And for any Aboriginal Australian folks who may be listening, please be aware that I will be using and referring to individuals now deceased. My main source for this episode, surprisingly, was a very thorough Wikipedia entry on the Park Center for Mental Health. And I didn't realize until halfway through my research that most of the information from Wikipedia was taken from a Queensland government site, so I'll be sure to provide a link for that too. I also used the book Goodna Girls by Adele Chenoweth and multiple newspaper articles from newspapers.com. All sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Goodna Mental Hospital. Last week I discussed the history of the Brisbane area in depth, but just to recap, because the same information applies here, Brisbane used to be home to the Moreton Bay Penal Settlement, where the worst of the worst offenders were sent from Sydney for isolation. The penal colony was dissolved in 1842, and Queensland became a colony in 1859. Goodna, southwest of Brisbane, had been named a village in 1856. After the dissolution of the Moreton Bay Penal Settlement, but before Queensland became a colony, mentally ill folks were sent to Sydney. Treatment for insanity wasn't really a thing, so they were mostly there for confinement. But after Queensland separated from New South Wales, lunatics, as they were known, were sent to the Brisbane jail. As I've mentioned with previous episodes, lunatics were poorly defined. They included people with genuine mental illnesses, people with developmental disorders, people with epilepsy, people struggling with addiction to substances, older folks experiencing cognitive decline, and the poor and unhoused. Anyone whose family didn't want to or couldn't care for them basically got sent to the local jail. And as we mentioned in the last episode, the 1860s was a rough time for the economy of Queensland. There was rampant unemployment, so naturally, the jails started to fill up. The population of Queensland began to increase, and talk of adding an asylum to relocate the mentally ill from the Brisbane jail began. In 1861, architect Charles Tiffin was tasked with the job of locating an appropriate site and to draw up plans for a 400-bed asylum. He recommended one area along the Brisbane River, halfway between Brisbane and Ipswich, but it was rejected in favor of another site near the Brisbane River and Woogaroo Creek. I should mention at this point, as I briefly did last week, that the name Woogaroo was a mispronunciation of an Aboriginal word, which meant to step over a person lying down. That seems ominously fitting for what the place would eventually become. Construction of the new asylum began in 1863, and by the end of 1864, operations were able to begin. On January 10, 1865, Woogaroo Lunatic Asylum officially opened. The first inmates were sent from the Brisbane jail to the asylum on January 12th. 7 warders, 2 of them women, and 10 police constables escorted 57 men and 12 women from the Brisbane jail to Woogaroo. They boarded a steamer and arrived at the asylum via the Brisbane River. The first inmates, as they were known, were separated by gender. Women remained on the ground floor, while men were placed mostly on the upper floor, with a few male inmates residing separately from the women on the ground floor. The first medical superintendent of the asylum was Dr. Kersey Cannon. Dr. Cannon had been the first private practitioner in Brisbane. He held various other positions, such as public vaccinator, medical officer to the jail, member and then president of the medical board, and coroner. And then in 1864, he was selected to be the superintendent of the new Woogaroo Lunatic Asylum. In 1866, a separate ward was built with the initial intention of it housing private-paying inmates. Unfortunately, the asylum was not in a place to receive private pay inmates, so after 2 years, the plan was abandoned. Instead, the new ward became a women's ward, and all the women inmates were transferred there. In 1867, only 2 years after opening, the asylum experienced its first government inquiry. It was conducted by Dr. Henry Challinor, who found that the management of the site appeared adequate. But only 2 years later, the asylum went through 2 more government inquiries. Quote, "The first one was conducted by public servants, and the second by a select committee of members from both houses of Queensland Parliament." End quote. The second inquiry showed evidence of mistakes and incompetency, particularly in regard to, quote, "inappropriate and insufficient accommodation on site, as well as with problems with cooking facilities and water supply." Op-eds in the local newspaper reported stories of patient abuse and neglect. Following these inquiries, Dr. Cannon was dismissed from his position as superintendent. The Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on Dr. Cannon states that he was, quote, "probably too easygoing to be concerned with the minutiae of office routine," and was, quote, "a muddling administrator," end quote. He was replaced, conveniently perhaps, by Dr. Challinor himself. The findings from the inquiries also led to the establishment of the Lunacy Act of 1869. One of the weak areas that was discovered was that new patients were mixed in with long-term chronic patients, causing them to blend in and not be adequately observed. So one of the primary changes brought by the Lunacy Act was the introduction of reception houses, which served as admission wards for new patients. They could stay there and be closely monitored for a month before transferring to another ward. Dr. Challinor worked diligently to introduce more recreational opportunities for patients, as well as adding a system of record keeping and improved sanitation. All of this took an incredible amount of time and energy. Within only a couple of years, Dr. Challinor began to feel ill. An op-ed in the Queenslander dated Friday, July 19, 1872, expressed dismay that Dr. Challinor had not adequately recovered following a 6-week break to care for his health. The writer sympathized that Dr. Challinor had taken over the asylum when it was in poor condition and had worked tirelessly to make much-needed improvements for the 222 patients who resided there. Ultimately, Dr. Challinor resigned from his post due to medical complications following a bout of typhoid fever. He was replaced by Dr. John Jopp. Now, I should note that some newspaper records list Dr. Jopp's name as Jasp, but his death record spells it Jaap, so that seems to be correct. Now, probably because Dr. Jopp was a young guy, he was all about recreation and having fun. In a November 22nd, 1873 article from the Queenslander, there was a description of a sports competition to celebrate the opening of a new sports oval. 120 male patients participated, while 40 female patients watched. Even members of the community joined to watch and cheer on the participants. And this article was a hoot to read, not only because of all the different events, but because of the descriptions of the patients and the prizes that were given. So I have to read some of this. It's just too good. Quote, "Shortly after 3 o'clock, Mr. Jesse, the warder, gave the signal to muster for the first event, a race of 410 yards open to all. Prize, a leather riding valise." And side note, what would a patient do with this? Not like he'd be traveling anywhere anytime soon. Anyway, At the request of Dr. Jopp, Mr. Arthur Martin kindly noted as judge in this and the subsequent contests, and Mr. A. Reed as starter. Although this race was announced as open to all, the entries only comprised 6 patients and a discharged patient. A semi-professional from Ipswich also wished to join in, but was very properly disqualified, much to his disgust. A good start was effected, and the running closely contested for about half the race, half the distance, when one by one the runners began to fall off, till the race was left between the ex-patient and an inmate who, both in this and subsequent contests, ran excellently. The ex fell off, however, towards the finish, and his antagonist won easily by several yards. To the visitors, there was hardly anything to indicate that all the competitors were not quite as sane as himself, but for some of the runners once or twice stopping in their course and turning a pirouette, much to the amusement of the gathering. End quote. I love the idea of the patients just twirling around once they'd stopped running. That's probably what I would be doing too. There was a sack race after this event, and the prize was a riding whip. And again, who thought of these prizes for patients? It seems like a very unhelpful and frankly stupid prize to give to an involuntarily hospitalized person, but whatever. In either 1873 or 1875, records are a little unclear, there were more problems with overcrowding, so a second story was added to the men's building. To celebrate the grand reopening of the hospital, a ball was held. Visitors from the community came and danced the night away until 5 a.m. The patients had to go to sleep at a reasonable hour somehow, but some were called upon to give toasts. Some patients gave 3 cheers for Dr. Jopp and 3 cheers for the visitors. And then I guess they just went to sleep and said something like, "Have fun and don't make too much noise?" Sadly, Dr. Jopp died suddenly on February 17th, 1877. He was only 39 years old. Patrick Smith took over as superintendent of Woogaroo Asylum after him. Dr. Smith was very future-minded, and he was concerned about the welfare of inmates after they discharged from the asylum. He recommended that a public organization be set up to assist those who discharge with no family support or work plans following their discharge. In a way, he was sort of the first social worker. It was also Dr. Smith who recommended that more asylums needed to be established in the area to relieve the overcrowding at Woogaroo. You may remember from last week's episode that the Sandy Gallop Asylum opened in 1878, so it was a product of Dr. Smith's recommendations. When it opened, only 50 of Woogaroo's patients were transferred to Sandy Gallop, but it was a start. Now, interestingly, a newspaper article from the Telegraph dated July 17, 1878, stated that 19% of inmates at Woogaroo Asylum were there for alcohol addiction. Remember that lunatics were made up of all sorts of psychiatric and physical maladies, and there wasn't any other facility, yet, for folks struggling with substance use. Just as a side note, what I'm not including in my notes here is all of the references made in the newspaper articles from that time that use extremely disturbing language about patients. There were racist comments made about Asian immigrants and South Sea Islanders. There were countless references to patients as, quote, creatures. And it just breaks my heart that these people, some of whom probably didn't even have a mental illness as we define it today, were subjected to language that described them as subhuman. They were truly shut away and pushed from society. In 1878, again with the effort to reduce overcrowding, a cottage ward was built to accommodate 60 women. The following year, in 1879, they added a wing intentionally for troubled women, quote unquote. 1880 was a year of many additions, thanks to a recent boom in the Queensland economy. The asylum added 2 wards that would hold 35 men and 35 women, and a kitchen and laundry facility that could service up to 500 patients. It was the same year that Woogaroo started going by Goodna Asylum. The 1884 Insanity Act officially made the shift in language from lunatic asylum to hospital for the insane. So Goodna Asylum became Goodna Hospital for the Insane. There was an attempt to destigmatize the words used for patients and to begin to recognize psychiatry as a legitimate branch of medicine for conditions that could be treated. In 1890, a massive flood inundated Brisbane and the surrounding area. You may remember that the original site of the hospital was situated right next to the Brisbane River and Woogaroo Creek, so it was accessed primarily by the water. The entire hospital at Goodna flooded, and patients needed to be transferred immediately. They moved patients to a building farther away from the river, uphill toward the railway. And now, for the first time, access to the hospital would be by train. Following the flooding, a new recreation hall was built that included a sewing room for women and large open rooms where they hosted dances and concerts and church services. But the respite wouldn't last long. In 1893, the Brisbane flood damaged the men's living quarters and flooded all of the staff residences. Once again, the hospital was forced to move further uphill and rebuild. I can't imagine how devastating and stressful this would have been to need to rescue patients from a flooded building and transfer them somewhere else. And goodness knows they didn't have the adequate staffing for it. It would be another 5 years before some of the residences were rebuilt. But in 1898, the Fleming House was completed with room for 50 men, and the Manor House was completed as a new superintendent's residence, just in time for the new medical superintendent, Dr. James Hogg, to arrive. You might remember that I mentioned Dr. Hogg in the last episode. He would eventually be named the Inspector of Hospitals for the Insane and would propose further developments in all the hospitals in Queensland. Unfortunately, he died before his vision could be realized, but fortunately, his successor, Dr. Ellerton, would go on to make good on Dr. Hogg's plans. By 1900, there were 1,728 patients in all 3 hospitals for the insane in Queensland, in Goodna, Ipswich, and the newly opened hospital at Toowoomba. To accommodate the increase in patients at Goodna, additional buildings were constructed in the first years of the 20th century. Alterations and additions were made to the women's ward, and a new men's ward was built, meaning that there were now 8 buildings to house men patients. In 1902, a morgue and a bathroom complex were added. Also in 1902, a major scandal happened. I mean, not really, but it took up almost a whole page of the newspaper, and I found it entertaining, so I had to include it here. So, in an article from the Queensland Times, dated Friday, October 24th, 1902, was this headline: 2 asylum attendants charged with intent to steal. Now, what, you may wonder, would attendants try to steal from an insane asylum? What could be so valuable that they would risk their jobs? Well, here's the story. Quote, at the Goodna Police Court yesterday, before the police magistrate and Mr. R.T. Porter, 2 young men named James Conahan and James Patrick Galligan, attendants at the Asylum for the Insane at Goodna, were charged that on the 25th of September they did sever and make movable certain vegetables, the property of J.B. Hogg, medical superintendent, with intent to steal the same. End quote. Yes, they tried to steal the prize-winning veggies. There's blah, 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 some legal stuff, but then the article gets into the details, which really that's the best part. Quote, Dr. Hogg, medical superintendent of the Hospital for the Insane at Goodna, stated that the defendants had both been attendants at the Goodna Asylum for about 2 or 3 years, but were at the present time under suspension. Makes me wonder why they were suspended. Complaints had been made by him to Constable Keene, officer in charge of the police station at Goodna. On September 25th, witness went to number 1 ward at the asylum shortly after 7 p.m., where he saw Constable Keene. They then walked towards the vegetable garden, and as they were doing so, attendant Thomas Kelly came out of his ward with a lantern and called out, "Who's there?" Witness spoke to him, and he accompanied them. On reaching the gate of the vegetable garden, they found it standing wide open. They walked towards the eastern end of the gate, where there was a tool house, which Constable Keene opened, and they found inside 2 pillow slips full of cabbages. They also discovered some shallots lying in bundles on the ground at the foot of the fence and some herbs on a seat, which was fixed against the fence. The shallots looked as if they had been freshly pulled. The vegetables were at this stage produced. The pillow slips were similar to those he saw on the night in question. They were marked L.A. under a crown. And I assume that's like L.A. like Lunatic Asylum? I don't really know. Anyway, and were like others he had seen at the institution. Keene also pointed out some freshly made footprints, which he pointed from the tool house towards the gate at which witness entered. End quote. It goes on for a long time, describing the details of how the suspects were caught. Spoiler alert, they got into the garden with their own key. And then it goes on to provide basically a script of what happened in court. The footprints were checked with the attendant's boots, and they matched the size. There were eyewitnesses that saw and talked to the attendants as they were stealing cabbages. The defense attorney called on the prosecution to produce the evidence, quote unquote. So does that mean to produce the produce? But they could not do so, ostensibly because it was probably rotten by then. But they weren't even able to finish because the case was adjourned for 8 days. So anyway, there you have it. The great produce scandal of 1902 at Goodna Hospital. I just had to include it. Stealing vegetables. Anyway, 6 years after the produce scandal, in 1908, Dr. Henry Byam Ellerton took over as superintendent after the sudden death of Dr. Hogg. Dr. Ellerton had been one of 26 applicants for the position, which included applicants from Australia and Britain. He had 14 years of experience working in asylums in England and was a supporter of moral therapy, which emphasized the importance of the surrounding environment, kindness by staff members, and treatment through work and recreation. He also opened the hospital to more visits by family members and friends. Dr. Ellerton wanted the hospital to be a self-sufficient community, so he focused on building the farm and gardens, which added more job opportunities for patients. No word, though, if they improved the security surrounding the gardens. An article in the Morning Bulletin, dated Wednesday, October 18th, 1911, stated that there were 1,261 patients at Goodna, 793 men and 488 women. When patients needed to be transferred, men were sent to Ipswich generally, whereas women were transferred to Toowoomba. Regarding staff, there were 81 attendants, 41 nurses, 3 head attendants, 1 matron, and 2 assistant matrons. So, excluding doctors, there was an approximate 1-to-9 staff to patient ratio. Not terrible considering the time period. And it seemed as though the number of attendants was growing in comparison to previous newspaper articles I read. This could be because Dr. Ellerton had started a training program for attendants the previous year. A constant theme throughout the early history of Goodna Hospital for the insane was overcrowding. So in 1915, they demolished some of the old residences and added 3 more patient residences for men: the Lewis House, Noble House, and McDonald House. In 1916, they added a ward for patients with physical diseases. And in 1917, they added a women's admission building called the Anderson House. They also added a hospital, administration building, powerhouse, water reservoir, and pumping stations. In 1918, they added another laundry building. So all of these helped improve the hygiene of the hospital overall. And you have to remember that this time period is not only World War I, but it's also the time of the influenza pandemic. So having clean water and fresh laundry capabilities were extremely important. Between 1910 and 1920, there was a 20% decrease in women patients, from 491 in 1910 to 389 in 1920. There wasn't a reason given for this, and I'm not really sure if I can speculate why. There was, however, a 30% increase in men patients from 779 in 1910 to 1,010 in 1920. And the reason for this seems a bit more obvious. Following World War I, there were more and more veterans being committed to institutions for war-related symptoms. Doctors didn't really know what to do with the men who came back from war with severe and never-before-seen mental illness. According to the National Archives of Australia, doctors had noticed patterns of symptoms in men returning from war. They included, quote, anxiety, panic attacks, tics, nightmares, impaired reasoning and/or inability to sleep, eat, or talk. At the same time, some doctors believed the condition was caused by physical rather than emotional issues, arguing that exposure to exploding shells caused lesions in the brain, end quote. They would later call these symptoms shell shock. In total, from 1914 to 1918, over 324,000 Australians served overseas in World War I, and 2/3 of them were injured or killed. Because doctors didn't really know what to do with veterans who showed evidence of shell shock, they were often misdiagnosed and sent to inebriate homes or to insane asylums. One man, just known as Mr. S. Parkinson, wrote a powerful letter to Queensland Senator Matthew Reid in October 1918. He tells the story of a veteran soldier who had fought alongside his son, now deceased, and was erroneously placed in an inebriate home. Here's his letter. Quote, Dear friend, knowing your kindness of heart and ever readiness to help those whom you think are not getting a fair deal, I am writing on behalf of a returned soldier, Corporal Joseph Slack, MM, A Company, 15th Battalion, one of the original Anzacs. I have taken an interest in him ever since he came back about 2.5 years ago, severely wounded, for the reason that he was in the same tent with my son, who was killed at Courtney's Post, at the camps at Angonia, Broadmeadows, Egypt, and Gallipoli. He fought in the South African War, and he was 44 years of age when he enlisted in Brisbane for service in the present war. He is a big lump of a man and used to be a miner. His mining experience proved of great service at Gallipoli. Both the Turks and Australians were mining below the trenches, and it became a question as to who should get in first. Mr. Slack recognized from the sounds heard by him that the Turks were almost ready for firing their mines, but he got in first and blew up the enemy's mines, thus saving the lives of his comrades, while adding to the death toll of the Turks. For his service, he was awarded the Military Medal. Unfortunately, when he got back to Brisbane, he was rather too fond of the drink, and the bad habit of shouting for the returned soldiers was the cause of his getting beyond the bounds of moderation. Afterwards, he pulled himself together and was up country for a while, superintending some excavation work, and laterally was employed by the Railway Department as night watchman at the Railway Commissioner's office in George Street. My daughter and myself often visited him there, and although he was very hard of hearing, the result of gunshot wounds in the head, we always enjoyed the meetings, finding him a very intelligent man above the average and very kind-hearted. Between 3 or 4 months ago, he got some money, and again the drink was the cause of trouble. I believe he had a fight, with the result that he was taken to the Brisbane hospital and was there some weeks. When he was getting better, the medical officer advised him to go to a home for soldiers at Dunwich, where there would be nurses and doctors, plenty of fishing, etc., and 3 months' holiday there would set him up again. And when he got down to Dunwich, he found instead of its being a rest home, he had signed on for 3 months at the Home for Inebriates at Dunwich. Unfortunately, I'm not able to get down to Dunwich to see Mr. Slack, but my daughter writes every week and sends him newspapers, etc., but he does not write back for the reason that all correspondence inward and outward has to be censored by the medical or other officer. Is this a fair deal for the men who have fought and bled for us? I know what your opinion is. Mrs. Hutchinson, the mother of a soldier's son who was also a tent mate of Corporal Slack and my son, and after being 3 times wounded is back again in the fighting line. And her stepdaughter, Mrs. Harvey, whose son was killed in action a few weeks ago, have visited Corporal Slack several times at Dunwich and tell me how very depressing it is for these brave returned heroes, suffering from shell shock, etc., to see the open graves, the funerals, the miserable wrecks of humanity, surely with all their faults. Those who have so nobly fought for us deserve better treatment than this. Will you kindly place the matter before the federal authorities and ask them to get some of these palpable wrongs righted? Excuse my long letter, but as a soldier dad, I feel very strongly on the subject, but I know it is in good hands now. With best personal wishes and regards, yours truly, signed S. Parkinson. End quote. And this seemed to be a common occurrence, that recent veterans returning from war weren't given the treatment they needed, but were often confined, which I assume would make their symptoms worse. Even today, combat-induced PTSD can be difficult to treat, but I imagine that incarcerating them essentially would not provide any sort of meaningful benefit. Meanwhile, back at Goodna, there was another inquiry into the hospital in the fall of 1915, but I'm not sure how seriously to take it because the main topic seemed to be about whether or not staff were drinking ginger beer laced with rum. Here are a couple excerpts from the article taken from the Queensland Times and dated Friday, October 1st, 1915. Quote, Conrad Brian Narung and Henry Wells Sturgis, clerks employed at the Goodna Asylum, gave evidence to the effect that it was customary to have a ginger beer in the office during the summer months. It was made on the premises. The attendant, Falvey, recommended to put a little rum in the ginger beer to take the harsh taste away. It was put to them in a casual way, such as, "How about trying rum in it? It takes the harsh taste out of it." End quote. So that was one complaint, but we'll get back to the rum and the ginger beer in a moment. And then the baker complained that the bread wasn't given sufficient time to rise. And then they mentioned that patients got 2 baths a week. And then another witness said that it wasn't true that people were drinking ginger beer with rum during surgery. That part is a little disturbing, because whoever was speaking considered rum to be horrible. And anyway, there were broken windows. Anyway, this is not so much of a report as it was a bullet list of findings and ramblings. During the 1920s, patients helped build a golf course that's still around today called the Gales Golf Club. Patients were also employed in the upkeep and maintenance of the greens. And just as a fun fact, this course hosted the 1955 Australian Open. Makes me wonder if patients were still helping with the course around that time. In 1929, the Osler House opened. It was designated as a residence for, quote, difficult women. 5 years later, in 1934, the Pierce House opened, which was a residence for, quote, difficult men. 2 years after that, in 1936, 3 more residences for men were built: the Gladstone House, Jenner House, and Kelsey House. Now, what's notable about these residences is that even though they were built in 1936, they still used the principles of moral therapy. The website didn't get into too many specifics, but I assume that this means the residences included large windows to allow for plenty of sunlight, wide hallways, colorful walls, and other similar features that place emphasis on a positive environment. And in 1936, Dr. Ellerton retired as medical superintendent at Goodna after 28 years of service. He was succeeded by Dr. Basil Stafford, but more on that next week, because that is where I'm going to pause the history of Woogaroo Lunatic Asylum / Goodna Hospital for the Insane for the week. Come back next week as I finish out the history until the current day. I'm also hoping to weave in some stories from people who worked and lived there. So thank you so much for listening. If you haven't done so already, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts, because that helps other people find and listen to the show. Be sure to also check out the Patreon page. I'm definitely going to go add in some more wacky newspaper stories because I came across a few doozies while researching for this week's episode. So you'll want to check those out. So again, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it so much. Please be sure to come back next week for more stories. And as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.